So, I want to talk about the movie Hereditary, a film I'd loosely describe as psychological horror, which follows a grieving family as they uncover occult secrets about the recently deceased family matriarch. Now, going into this film, I hadn't heard a lot of buzz about it other than some people saying that the ending really fucked with their heads and left them feeling uneasy long after they had left the theater. The highest praise you can really give a psychological horror film. And so between this testimony and the few bits of promotional artwork I saw for the film, I assumed I would be watching a movie very similar to The Babadook. You know, that very well-shot, low-key indie horror vibe. And oh, fuck was I wrong. Because this movie is hella traumatic, and not at all in the way that horror movies tend to be. Because it takes its time setting up the characters and getting the audience invested in them. Which is, honestly, similar to The Babadook and what I signed up for with this film. But, as it turns out, the film has a different agenda. And as the second half of the film progresses, things become much more supernatural. And starts to have more in common with more traditional crappy horror films. And yet, because these characters have been built up so much, and as the audience we are hopefully invested in their struggles, it becomes really hard to watch. And that's the big thing with this film, is that subtle deconstruction of giving a shit about who this is all happening to changes so much of it, but also makes it feel like two movies smushed together end to end. Now, I'm going to begin getting into some spoilers of major plot points in the movie, so if you want to avoid those, you should probably stop listening then. Just see yourself out, okay? So, as I mentioned earlier, the first half of the film is very much a character-driven drama. There's a family dealing with grief and a lot of hang-ups over the mysterious past of the grandmother of the family. And it feels like there's a lot of dysfunction within the family unit already. The mother is a obsessive artist who makes miniatures. The husband seems a little bit like reluctantly supportive of everything going on, just trying to be the anchor. And of the two kids, we've got a older son who is in high school and a younger sister who has a peanut allergy and is coded as autistic. One of her stim behaviors, making a with her mouth, ends up being a major plot point. And yeah, all of them are sad about Grandma being dead and not really knowing much about Grandma growing up and all of her strange secrets. So one of the biggest reasons that I'm conflicted over this beginning section is that they sort of set up some thematic non sequiturs, things that are repeating elements in this first half build-up that don't really play into what goes on in the final climax. The biggest offender for me is the mother's miniature creations. She makes miniature versions of their house and a couple other important locations throughout the film. And those never really factor into any of the, reality warping. What's real feels that the beginning of the movie starts to lay down before ditching to go in a completely supernatural direction. And another one is actually in the title of the movie itself, Hereditary. Early on, the mother mentions that other members of her family died committing suicide, and the beginning of the film's kind of set up the mom and her children as having, schizophrenic style disorders, which seemed to me, at least, like it was setting up for some sort of commentary on that. But no, we have to summon Budget Satan. Which brings me to my criticisms of the second half of the movie, which is basically that it's the plot of Rosemary's Baby, a influential horror movie that I also really don't like. General plot of that movie being, hey, we move into an apartment, I'm pregnant, but it turns out that everyone else who lives in the building are cultists trying to birth Satan. And I can't say that Hereditary does this plot all that much better. Outside of Joan, who the mother meets through a support group, we don't really have much of a presence from the cultists, even though they're supposedly the ones pulling all the strings. And while I can respect that this is a horror movie that's not trying to constantly explain itself or justify why everything's happening, I can imagine it being very easy to get confused with this movie about why anything's happening. And Paimon being the demon of mischief and chaos doesn't really help there be any consistency to what happens in this movie. That being said, I think the dread in this film is a lot more palpable, and the fact that they do have some more active and violent scenes towards the end, I think adds interest that Rosemary's Baby didn't have. But I had a big fat fucking groan as soon as the mother is looking through grandma's old stuff and there's all this cult shit about how to, give a demon a fucking body. Pro tip, it's always children. Always children. And an advantage that I had on viewing this was that I was watching it with a couple of people who'd already seen it. So after the movie, we got to clarify a couple of points that we were confused on, and they were able to rewind the film to points to show us where we had missed information. Which, on one hand, I'm like, cool, there's replay value to this movie, but at the same time, this movie is also kind of hard to follow. And side note, I really didn't like the weird exposition dump that happens right at the end of the movie. I feel like that might have been tacked on after the original cut or something. Like maybe the film didn't test well initially, and when they added that in, people were like, oh, I get it, I know what's going on now. But to me, it really felt awkward, out of place, and just had me asking more questions about what the shit just happened. Now that I've got my grievances out of the way, let's dump some praise here on the film, because despite everything, I think this was a film worth watching. I'm glad I saw it, and it is still lingering in the back of my mind several days later, gnawing at the frayed ends of my sanity. First up, this movie knows when to use violence, and I think that's a really underrated and understated thing, because when Charlie died, that felt like a legitimate shock to the system. You are right there in that moment with Peter, and you don't have a reprieve from it. And the really gross shot that they have of Charlie's body the next day is so uncomfortable. But we're not drenched with other violence in the vicinity of that moment. That happens, and we're allowed to stew in it. And even further into the movie, when the action starts picking up a bit more, these extreme moments of sudden violence only present themselves every once in a while amidst the, frantic stuff that's going on and the just sheer dread of the situation at hand. There's nothing really to cheapen the impact of these moments. And it's this kind of patience that I associate with a lot of the best horror movies I've seen. The Exorcist and Halloween are movies that take a while to draw you in, and by the end of the movie, everything has changed. The mood, the tension. These are movies that don't play all their cards right up front, and use tension and silence and a lull from the action in powerful ways so that when they come back, it's just so visceral. But on the flip side, I can understand why this won't appeal to all horror fans, because this movie is not meant to be fun. It's really a masochistic viewing experience, and it's a lot to ask people to invest in that amount of time for an end product that your mileage may vary on and is going to be asking you more questions than making you feel fulfilled. So, in conclusion, I like this film, but I had a pretty mixed first reaction to it. Is it perfect? No. Would I watch it again? Probably. Did it make me uncomfortable? Yeah! If you're interested in further analysis of this film, there's a good YouTube review by StrucciMovies that helped me figure out a bit of my feelings after watching this film, and it goes in depth with the director's intent in making Hereditary, which I found very interesting. Their channel also has an interesting ongoing series about parasocial relationships, which at this point has amassed several hours worth of video material. Anyway, that was my feelings on Hereditary. Thanks again for listening to my cruddy opinions, and I'll be back again soon.